Hello lovely sewing people of the internet, welcome to my channel. It's Hila here, Saturday Night Stitch. Today's video is a little bit different. This is more of a really slow going sewing room vlog type video, sharing with you how I sewed up my self-drafted A-line skirt that I'm showing you just now. This is a skirt pattern that I developed from my own personal sloper using the Craftsy class by the excellent and outstanding Susie Fur. I'm using a linen viscose mix fabric that I got from Fabrics for All. So this is a literally from start to finish vlog with some lovely meditative music along the way. So we're gonna just take it nice and easy and just hang out with me as I show you how I go about creating some of my garments. Most of the fabrics that I work with I will pre-wash on a 30-degree wash, and I will tumble dry on low, and this is just because that's how all of my garments have to be sort of easy to look after, and that's how I do it. So if I can't do that with a fabric, it's not a fabric that I would generally consider working with. So I'm actually using my cutting table, which I very rarely use, but because it's a skirt pattern, the table sort of has enough space for it. I have pressed the fabric, and because it's a linen viscose mix fabric, it's quite easy to find the grain just by lining it up. And it also helps that the shopkeeper at Fabrics for All, she knows what she's doing, so when she cuts out a length of fabric for you, it's going to be easy to get it onto the grain. The sewing pattern that I have it transferred onto baking parchment, and baking parchment is a lot easier to use because it's transparent and it's see-through, which is very helpful when it comes to pattern matching. I'm not going to be doing any pattern matching with this particular pattern, but it's just a tip for using baking parchment. My heavy-duty quilting ruler is always very useful for making sure that I'm aligning things up on the straight grain. And I use this ruler every single time I cut out. It's definitely a good investment. I'm trying to use up all of the fabric that I have, so I will be lengthening the skirt pattern pieces. And so that I can utilize as much of the fabric as possible, instead of cutting out two pieces of the waistband and using the same fabric for the waistband facing, I'm actually going to use a different fabric for the facing, so that I only have to cut out one piece of the contoured waistband. This is another great use for this ruler that I have, this heavy duty quilting ruler. It makes it easier for me to lengthen any patterns that need to be lengthened. And when I use it for the grain line, I will line up the edge, the shorter edge of the ruler with the selvage edge, and then I'll just shift the pattern along until I can get the straight grain down the line. Because the ruler is so heavy as well, it sort of works as a weight on the lightweight baking parchment. When it comes to my sewing room, I tend to use things that I already have around. So my pattern weights are these super advanced rocks that we picked from Llandudno in Wales on the beach there, and I've been using these for years. When I'm cutting out downstairs, I will use cans of food. I also have this Tailors chalk, which I think is an indispensable thing to have in your sewing room. It's just useful, especially for woven fabrics like this linen viscose mix. It doesn't work for all types of fabric, but you need to have a different range of marking tools. So this is my next favorite one, along with the Friction pens. I think cutting out is possibly one of my favorite things to do in a project, especially using really nice sharp dressmaking shears. I added 1/2 inch seam allowances to the pattern itself. This was drafted to have these angular yoke pockets at the hip, but I'm not doing it this way with this fabric because I don't actually have enough to do that. So I'm just cutting straight up just like that. And that's one of the joys of sewing your own clothes. You can play around with it in whichever way you want to. So I'm doing a lot of Tetrising there to get the longest length that I can out of this fabric that I have. So much so that one corner of my waistband is jutting in a little bit into the hem, but that doesn't matter because that's a 1 inch hem that's going to get folded under. One of the best pieces of sewing advice I ever took on was just realizing the concept of putting everything away when you're not going to need it anymore. And that's really helped me with my sewing room stewardship in terms of keeping it nice and tidy enough for me to look forward to going back into the sewing room. I used to just sort of leave things lying around in my excitement to move on to the next project, but I think it is helpful to put things away, also because you don't lose any pattern pieces, which has happened to me before. My self-drafted patterns live in these little Ziploc bags that are labeled with a Sharpie, good old Sharpie. You can never go wrong with a Sharpie, except for when you write on your walls, which probably shouldn't do that. Anyway, back to sewing. I'm very happy with the amount of leftover scraps on this fabric. It's just really satisfying when that happens. So I decided to add some patch pockets, but I made them angled because I didn't have enough fabric to make them square patch pockets. Again, this was me trying to use up as much of the fabric as is possible. Now, in order to get really nice crisp pocket tops on your patch pockets, interfacing the top edge is critical. So I use scraps of interfacing. I never throw out bits of interfacing because they just come in handy. And as you can see, I'm patchworking the interfacing on the patch pockets. I have overlocked the center back seams in anticipation for installing a zipper later on. So working on the pockets, I'm just going to fold down the tops of the pockets along where I've put the interfacing in. So aside from giving your pockets a nice crisp edge, interfacing them means that they won't actually gape if you use your pockets as much as I do, because these are not going to be ornamental pockets, because pockets are everything. I have very strong opinions about pockets. So I'm just preparing those, and the fuzzier side, the side that's a little bit more frayed, is going to be tucked under and pressed, and then I'm just going to pop them along the side seams on the front. Now, because my print is quite a big print, I can get away without any matching here. As you can see, it would be very I think you'd be very hard pressed to tell that I haven't print matched unless you are a fellow seamstress. But at least we've added pockets and we've used up whatever little bits of fabric there was to be used. I also wanted to point out that I interfaced the seam where the zipper is going to go. That would just make it look really nice and sharp. So I will now attach the contoured waistband matching the center notches after I've sewn the side seams together. I've interfaced this particular pattern piece, and then the facing is just going to be a Q-Pro lining. I find sewing a contoured waistband so intrinsically satisfying. It is opposing curves, but there's just something about it that is so satisfying. And we have a garment. I always get excited at this stage when, you know, it's like the jigsaw pieces are beginning to come together, and at which point we are going to press that contoured waistband. I like to use my Tailors ham, which by the way is another incredibly important thing to have in a sewing room. I sewed for about 6 months without having a Tailors ham, thinking, oh, it's not necessary, and then eventually I did buy one, and I just could not believe how much of a difference it made to my sewing. So whenever I'm giving anybody advice who wants to start sewing, I'm sort of like, you need to get a Tailors ham right from the get-go. It makes a huge difference. So does a clapper, especially if you want your seams to look really very nice and neat and trim. I will grade the seam just by trimming off the interfaced seam allowance, and that's usually enough for me. The facing is this really beautifully lightweight Q-Pro fabric, also known as Bemberg, which I bought from an Italian sewing supplies shop. I love using this for lining because it is very soft, but it is also incredibly durable. And once I've sewed it on, I will press it. I did make a mistake. I will fess up to that, and I actually sewed on that facing wrong, but I sort of fixed it, and if you stay tuned you'll see what I did to actually fix it. So everything was going beautifully up until the point that I realized that I had sewn it incorrectly. I had sewn the wrong seam to it, which meant that there wasn't enough fabric, enough of the facing to cover it in the way that I wanted to, and I didn't realize until much later. I managed to save it in my usual better sewn than perfect fashion. I used to get really hung up on trying to make my sewing projects as perfect, as Pinterest perfect as is possible, which led me down a path where I sort of lost the joy of sewing, because I would feel like if I made a mistake I had to, you know, completely undo everything and start over. So in the past this would have ended up as a UFO, because I would be thinking, oh my gosh, I have to unpick everything and I have to cut out another piece and try and do that. And in my excitement and eagerness to move on to other sewing projects, I would tell myself that, oh well, there's other things to do, and leave it at that. but ever since I really embraced the better sewn than perfect, I have found that there is a lot of joy in solving the mistake without necessarily having to make it perfect. And I do that with a lot of my makes. There will be something a little bit wrong with it, but with each project that I make, I get a little bit better, and that's good enough for me. So I do some grading as well on that top bit, and again, right up at this point, I still hadn't realized that I had made a mistake in sewing that seam together. Basically, the seam that was supposed to be sewn to that is the seam that was at the top, and by the point I had done the grading, as I said back in the day, this would have then become a UFO, because I would have been thinking, how am I going to sort out the fact that I've already cut off the seams, and this is going to be unfixable, it's not going to be perfect. But I think you'll love what I did to fix it, and yeah. Who else loves understitching? This was one of those things that I used to skip when I was a baby seamstress, because I thought, oh, I want to get the project done so quickly. But my gosh, it is so satisfying, the turn of cloth that you get when you understitch. It's something that I very rarely skip now. Once that is done, I will move on to the zip, and I'm using this cotton zipper tape. It's an invisible zip. I was lucky enough to have in my stash, I've got an extensive stash of zips actually, something that very much matched the bright yellow linen viscose. So I find that finishing overlocking the seam before I add the zipper makes it so much easier and so much neater. A little tip that I learned to line up your waistband is to mark it on the zipper tape, and that way when you sew your zipper on, you make sure that that seam of the waistband matches that one exactly. That first pull of the zipper after finishing installation is so incredibly satisfying. I like to finish my waistbands usually by hand, but I was very happy with the installation of the zipper. It looks as near invisible as I can get it. And did I mention how much I love pressing this fabric? Linen viscose is just such a joy to press. So linen is a lovely fabric. It's an amazing fabric to wear. It's also an amazing fabric to sew with, but it does need a lot of steam to get it to behave. But when you add in viscose, you know, it becomes even more joyful to sew with. I do like the linen viscose mixes that I have worked with so far. So it was at this point when I had to turn under the waistband that I realized my mistake, and I quickly figured out that the only way forward was for me to do these giant notches in the lining, and that I was going to have to hand sew it. Now, hand sewing covers a multitude of sins. You can mess up, but there's very little that hand sewing cannot fix. So I set myself up and did the beeswax on the thread, took off my cardigan and just set to it. It was going to take me a little bit longer than I had planned, but it was better than making this become a UFO. The thing about hand sewing is that I think it's a necessary ingredient for a garment to be handmade. You can easily make a skirt completely on a sewing machine, finishing off the waistband by doing crack stitching and things like that. But I do feel that when I'm making my stuff by hand, I do want it to have an element of having something being sewn on by hand. It wasn't my plan with this one, but the waistband ended up being this pick-stitched Frankenstein monstrosity on the inside, which has held up really well actually, because I have worn this skirt several times and it's been washed and it's been fine. That's the thing about hand stitching, it's actually very strong, and you have to remember that they weren't sewing all of those fabulous gowns from the 17th century with sewing machines or anything like that. They were using hand stitching. So it's coming together now and it's very exciting. This is a super quick project, so this is day 2. Actually, it took me 2 sessions in the sewing cave to actually sew this together. A simple and quick hem finish is just to overlock the hem and then to just turn it under, press it, and then sew it up. I always like to slow down when I get to this point, because this is my most vulnerable point at which I start to make mistakes. When I'm on that home straight, when I'm about to reach that finish line. In the past, that's where I've tripped up and, you know, I had a spectacular self-own by doing something silly. So I tend to try and slow down so that I'm not as giddy. It's also one of my favorite parts of the sewing project, because I really learned how to be mindful and enjoy doing the final finishing touches and taking my time with it, mostly so that I don't make mistakes and end up with UFOs, but it is very gratifying to be able to finish it. The beauty of developing your own sloper is that you can literally wait until you have completely finished it to put it on, because you know it's going to fit you perfectly. And I really have to recommend Susie Furr's Craftsy class, the skirt sloper class. I learned so much from that, and the skirt sloper that I developed back in 2015 is the one that I use as the basis for the skirts that I have. And as you can see, it does have a really good fit, and this is exactly what I wanted, an A-line flare style skirt that's just really popping, and it got a lot of wear in summer, as I said, and because it's linen viscose, it was very easy to sew up. So the one thing that I would probably change next time is not adding those patch pockets, and that's because the fit of this skirt is so close, because that was the design that I was going for. If I use the pockets, whatever's in the pockets really shows up because it's not quite loose, so consequently I haven't actually used the pockets that much at all because of that. So I didn't really need to do the pockets, but those are some of the design line considerations that you have to make when you have the joy of drafting your own patterns. Thank you so much. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, that you found it useful, informative, entertaining, relaxing, and if you did, do give it a big thumbs up down below. If you're not already, please do subscribe. I am mad about sewing, and I share everything to do with sewing related stuff that goes on in my mind and in my sewing cave here. Take care now. Happy sewing. Bye.